All right, good afternoon, folks. My name is Melanie Houston, and I'm Director of Water Policy and Environmental Health for the Ohio Environmental Council. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started with our webinar today. Please go ahead and make sure to check your speakers and your phone connection. If you're experiencing difficulties, you can type into the chat box to ask questions if you're having technical difficulties. Also, a couple of notes. Today's webinar will be recorded. So that if you'd like to share this webinar as a resource with colleagues or go back over and revisit bits of information, you'll be able to do that. And we will also be sending an evaluation survey through email to you at the end of today's webinar. So if you could please take a moment and fill out that survey for us. It should take less than 5 minutes, and we would be very grateful. So before we get started with today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about the Ohio Environmental Council for those of you who may not be aware of our organization. The OEC's mission is to secure healthy air, land, and water for all who call Ohio home, and we use legislative initiatives, legal action, scientific principles, and statewide partnership to secure a healthier environment for Ohio's families and Ohio's communities. We have several thousand individual members, and we have 100 group members. And collectively, the OEC staff has more than 100 years of experience advocating for a cleaner and healthier Ohio. At the OEC, I am responsible for establishing and managing statewide policy initiatives relating to water and environmental health, and I work on policy, regulation, public outreach, and education related to shale gas development or fracking in Ohio, and I'm also the state lead campaign organizer for the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families campaign, which is a national effort to protect families from toxic chemicals. Today's webinar will focus on coal tar-based pavement seal coats. And this is a kind of new area of concern for the OEC, a new area of work that we're moving into. Scientists have identified this commonly used seal coat as a major source of dangerous chemicals in streams and lakes and a significant health risk to the public, especially young children. These chemicals, which will soon be discussed in depth, are found in the sediments of nearby lakes and streams from pavements coated with this type of product. And our expert guest speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Barbara Mahler. Dr. Barbara Mahler is a research hydrologist with the USGS at the Texas Water Science Center. She is part of the Contaminant Trends in Lake Sediments team, which uses cores of sediments from lakes to reconstruct the contaminant histories of watersheds. This team has been instrumental in identifying and quantifying the importance of coal tar-based parking lot seal coat as a source of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons at the national scale. Barbara's research includes evaluating contaminant sources from rooftop runoff, suspended sediments in streams, contaminated runoff from parking lots, and also household dust. With no further ado, I will hand over the microphone to Barbara, and please enjoy the presentation today. Just hang on just a moment with us, Barbara.
While we're passing the screen over to me, I wanted to let you know that it is a pleasure to be invited today to present the results of USGS research on this subject. And let's see, we should be able to, and there we go. Let me tell you a little bit about the USGS and how we got involved in this work. The U.S. Geological Survey is the sole science agency, is the sole earth science agency for the U.S. Department of the Interior. And the USGS is tasked with providing impartial information on the health of the nation's ecosystems and environment, among other things. One of the major USGS goals is to communicate our scientific information to other federal and state agencies, to public policymakers, and to the public. I want to make sure to underline that the USGS is not a regulatory agency, and I'm not here to advocate for any public policy, but rather to share with you what we've learned during our 10 years of research on coal tar-based pavement sealants and implications for human health and environmental health. So how did the USGS get here? The USGS has several different areas of study, and one of the largest is the study of water availability, and water quality, and that includes the quality of sediments that are associated with our streams and lakes. As Melanie mentioned, I'm part of a team that has been reconstructing trends in the contaminant history of watersheds using sediment cores. And in fact, the identification and explanation of water quality trends is one of the major goals of the USGS National Water Quality Assessment Program. That's the NAWQA program. And as part of our studies, we've traveled across the United States. We've collected sediment cores from many, many lakes, and we've identified upward or downward trends in a number of different types of chemicals that associate with sediment. So those would be things like some of the organic chlorine pesticides, PCBs, heavy metals, and also PAHs. If we look at it at a national scale, each one of these symbols represents a lake where we've collected a sediment core, and the upward and downward arrows indicate statistically significant trends in these different compounds. And I guess it's no surprise that we see, as a result of controlling substances like DDT and PCBs in the environment, in many lakes we're now seeing downward trends. We see decreasing concentrations in lake sediments in those contaminants. What was a surprise to us is that we saw a number of upward trends in PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And this was a surprise because in the 60s and 70s, there were a number of publications that came out that said that trends in PAHs were decreasing. Concentrations were decreasing because of improvements in things like coal burning and home heating. I don't know why it's doing that. However, those studies were primarily done in lakes in rural or undeveloped areas, and many of our lakes are in urban areas. So what we're really seeing is an increase in PAHs in areas where we live and work. Of course, when we saw these trends, being environmental scientists, we wanted to figure out why they were occurring. As scientists, we're really detectives. We go out, we collect evidence, we look for clues to explain why we see the things that we're seeing. And one of the first clues as to what these upward trends in PAHs were being caused by came not from our big national study, but instead from a local study that was being led by scientists with the city of Austin. And they had been collecting sediment samples from very small urban streams and drainages. And when I say urban, I don't mean intensive inner city or industrial areas, but these were in areas of single and multifamily residential housing, like commercial areas, really, again, the kinds of areas where we live and work. And they were measuring concentrations of a whole range of different contaminants, and they measured very, very high concentrations of PAHs in some of these small residential drainages. By high, to put this into context, some of these concentrations were in the thousands of milligrams per kilogram, or parts per million. This is the range of concentrations that we typically measure at Superfund sites. For example, at old sites where there's coal has been coked, which is a major source of high concentrations of PAHs, or old wood treatment and creosote sites that have now been named as Superfund sites. We typically see concentrations in the same range as what were measured in these streams. In terms of the importance of this type of range of concentrations, the probable effect concentration, which is the concentration of PAHs at which we would expect to see harm to the fauna, the ecological community that's living in the sediments, is only 23 milligrams per kilogram, or parts per million. So these were extremely high concentrations. It was a bit of a mystery as to what source could be responsible for such high concentrations, because these are residential areas. These are not Superfund sites. And a worker with the city of Austin walked upstream and he saw parking lots. He saw parking lots for apartment complexes. And at first thought, well, could it be asphalt? But asphalt actually has pretty low concentrations of PAHs. It can't be responsible for concentrations in the thousands of ppm. But he noticed that the parking lots where the concentrations of PAHs were high had been treated with a black substance. They'd been painted with Sealcoat, and that Sealcoat was a coal tar-based product. And that's really the beginning of our story. So there are two types of parking lot sealant. Parking lot sealant is a product that is marketed as improving the longevity of the underlying asphalt and also improving the appearance of the asphalt itself. It makes it look black and like new. And Sealcoat is typically used on parking lots, on driveways, and even on some playgrounds. It is rarely, if ever, used on public roads. There are two major types of parking lot, or here it's called driveway sealer, comes by a lot of different names. A lot of different, there are two different major formulations of Sealcoat. One is an asphalt-based Sealcoat, or petroleum-based, which is primarily used west of the Continental Divide. And east of the Continental Divide, we primarily use a coal tar-based sealer. If you're interested afterwards, we can go into some of the potential reasons why there's this geographic difference. But essentially, in the part of the area, if you're there in Ohio, most of the Sealcoat that's being used in your area is likely this coal tar-based product. Now, these different formulations look very similar. They make the parking lot black and look like new, but they have very different chemistries, very different concentrations of PAHs. Coal tar pitch and crude coal tar are both known human carcinogens. And the Sealcoat products contain typically about 25% to 35% coal tar pitch or crude coal tar by weight. So we're talking, a lot of times when you look on the active ingredients of a product, it's down there in the 1 or 2%. But in the coal tar Sealcoat products, it's typically about 1/3 of the product is coal tar pitch. Why are coal tar and coal tar pitch human carcinogens? Well, they contain a lot of chemicals. They contain a wide range of chemicals, but most of those chemicals are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or related compounds. And polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which from now on we'll call PAHs, of those, at least 7 are probable human carcinogens. And there's a very wide range of literature that has described their possibility to cause cancer, to cause birth defects, to cause death, and to cause mutations among a wide variety of organisms. So what are PAHs? It's a long name. There are many different chemicals in this family, but the basic concept is pretty simple. The molecule that I'm showing here is a benzene ring. It has 6 carbon atoms in a planar ring like this, each with a hydrogen attached to it. And the benzene ring is the building block of PAHs. You can think of this 6-sided ring kind of like a 6-sided bathroom tile. And like bathroom tiles, you can combine benzene rings in different numbers and different geometric configurations, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rings, and every one of those different configurations is a PAH. To make things even more complicated, here where we have the carbons at the end, you can substitute other types of elements. You can substitute a nitrogen or a sulfur, or you can substitute hydroxyl, or even there's a number of different compounds that can get stuck onto the ends of these, and those also are PAH-related chemicals. But we're going to stick for our discussion today just to these PAHs that aren't substituted with any other elements, just the ones that are carbon and hydrogen, and these are referred to as the parent PAHs. And the 16 parent PAHs that are the most studied, and the ones I'll be presenting here today, have been listed by the US EPA as priority pollutants. PAHs, where do they come from? They're created whenever we burn organic material or when we combust organic material to create products. So PAHs are found in used motor oil. For example, when your car burns motor oil and that motor oil goes from being a clear greenish color to being a thick inky black, that's because the combustion within the hot engine of your car is actually creating PAHs. PAHs are found in automobile exhaust, they're found in tires, they're found in asphalt, they're found in industrial emissions, and to that list we're going to add the fact that they're also in coal tar seal coat. So if there are these urban sources of PAHs all over the place, how do we go about determining which of these might be the most important contributors to PAHs in our environment? And particularly, from my point of view, what's causing these upward trends in PAHs in lake sediments? Well, first of all, let's put into context how much PAHs are in each of these different sources, because that can make a big difference. For example, if we think about radioactivity, there's radioactivity in a banana, but that doesn't mean that radioactivity, say, from a radioactive spill is okay. So we want to try and put into context the different concentrations of PAHs in these different sources. So here's a list of different urban sources and published PAH concentrations. I mentioned earlier that asphalt has a relatively low concentrations of PAHs, and these are concentrations so low as what we might typically find occurring naturally in the environment. However, as we go up into more anthropogenic sources, we find higher and higher concentrations of PAHs. And you see that in your fresh motor oil only has 4 parts per million of PAHs, whereas used motor oil has almost 100 times more because of that combustion process in your engine. Let's take a look at PAH concentrations in our 2 types of seal coat. The asphalt-based seal coat has concentrations that are about on the order of what we would find in tire particles. The coal tar-based seal coat contains anywhere from about 50,000 to as much as 200,000 milligrams per kilogram of PAHs, much higher than any of these other typical urban sources. So in other words, 1 gallon of off-the-shelf coal tar-based seal coat contains about the same amount of PAHs as 100 gallons of used motor oil. So if you live in Ohio, I don't have to tell you that coal tar or that seal coat itself is very commonly used. Many homeowners seal their driveways. Many property owners seal their parking lots. According to the industry, about 85 million gallons of coal tar-based seal coat are used every year. And that's enough to cover about 170 square miles. This product is reapplied. It wears off, and the manufacturers recommend that it be reapplied anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And in fact, many zealous homeowners will have their driveway seal coated every year to keep it looking like new. That's an issue because the dried seal coat particles are mobile. While it looks nice and dark and shiny right after it's applied, the erosive action, the friction of car tires abrades the dried seal coat product into tiny little particles, which can then be washed off or blown away into other areas. If you go out and you just sweep up dust off a seal-coated parking lot, you'll find all these little black bits, and all of those little black bits are eroded seal coat, and so they have very high concentrations of PAHs. How high are those concentrations? Well, that's one of the first things we set off to do. We were interested in finding out whether this was just a contamination problem in Austin, Texas, or whether it was a problem that was affecting other areas in the United States. So we have the Sealcoat product, which is applied and then is eroded into pavement dust, and there are a lot of different places that pavement dust can end up. It can get washed off, and it can run into stormwater control, such as stormwater retention ponds. This is an area that the University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center and, in fact, the state of Minnesota have spent quite a bit of effort investigating, because if we end up with high PAH concentrations in the sediment in stormwater retention ponds, it becomes a very important economic issue when it comes to cleaning out those ponds and disposing of that contaminated sediment. And the state of Minnesota and many cities in Minnesota had determined that this was becoming an economic burden for those cities. If it doesn't get held up in stormwater controls, it can go into streams and lakes, and that's where the USGS has taken a large interest in this particular problem. The abraded seal coat can also adhere to tires and get transported onto other unseal-coated surfaces, or it can get blown by wind and end up in adjacent soils. It can also stick to the bottoms of your shoes or to your pet's paws and get tracked into your home. And finally, not associated with particles, but associated with the product itself, PAHs can volatilize from the pavement into the air. And we're going to talk about each of these different pathways, starting with the pavement dust itself. So as we were collecting sediment cores from different lakes for a couple of years, we also swept parking lots. I have to say I love my job. I get to go out and sweep dust off of parking lots. But what we saw was a very interesting illustration of what we had heard from applicators about the predominance of the asphalt-based seal coat in the western United States and the coal tar-based seal coat in the eastern United States. And what we found bore that out. Concentrations of PAHs in pavement dust from sealed parking lots in the eastern U.S. were about 1,000 times higher than off of sealed parking lots in the western United States. So this bore up what we had been told about geographic differences in use. But when we went and we swept dust off of unsealed parking lots in those very same watersheds, we saw much lower concentrations. So what this is telling us is that all of those other urban sources of PAHs, things like eroded tire particles and leaking motor oil and vehicle emissions, which these unsealed parking lots are also receiving, they're not the cause of these high concentrations of PAHs. It has to be the coal tar-based seal coat that's causing these high concentrations in the dust. So what happens to that dust? Where does it go? Well, it's shown collecting in gutters here, and you can even see where the seal coat has been applied across this storm drain. And this dust washes down the storm drain and either ends up in VMPs or it washes into streams and ultimately into lakes. How important is that contribution to the PAHs that we're measuring in the lakes? In other words, what we're really interested in finding out, particularly with these upward trends we're seeing, are most of the PAHs that we see in lakes coming from atmospheric deposition? Are they coming from car tires? Are they coming from other urban sources? Or are they coming from coal tar-based seal coat? So in order to get a handle on this, we used what's called environmental forensics, or PAH fingerprinting. And we take advantage of the fact that there are a number of different PAHs. There's actually hundreds of them, but we're going to focus on just a handful of them because different PAH sources have a different PAH fingerprint. Well, what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at coal burning emissions. And here we're looking at a handful of PAHs, the parent PAHs going from those with 3 benzene rings up to 5 or 6 benzene rings. And the proportion of the total that is made up of these different PAHs for coal burning emissions is different for each PAH. And so you can think of the shape of this profile as being the PAH fingerprint for coal burning emissions. And we can compare to it the PAH fingerprint for lake sediments, in this case from a lake called Lake Ann in Reston, Virginia, which is near Washington, D.C. And if we look at the fingerprint for Lake Ann, we see that it's kind of similar to that for coal burning emissions, and we can compare the two statistically, and our correlation coefficient is 0.6. If it were 0.1, it would mean a perfect match. If it were 0, it would mean no match at all. So this is indicating that, well, yeah, maybe some of the PAHs in the Lake Ann sediments are coming from coal emissions. So here's the fingerprint for gasoline vehicle emissions, and we can compare that also to those for Lake Ann sediment and compare them statistically, and we get a slightly higher correlation coefficient. So yes, perhaps there's some contribution from gas vehicle emissions to Lake Ann. Here's the PAH fingerprint for coal tar dust as we've collected off the parking lots across the eastern United States. And if we compare that to Lake Ann sediment, we get a correlation coefficient that's quite close to 1. Not a perfect match, but very close. So this is indicating that just on the basis of the PAH fingerprints, coal tar dust is a pretty good candidate to be the source of the PAHs. But this is still a fairly simplistic view, because clearly there has to be multiple sources of PAHs to any lake. So we would like to find an approach where we could better quantify how much each of these different sources might be contributing to our lake sediments. And to do that, we use a statistical method that was developed by the EPA. And essentially the idea is, into this statistical model, we give it the PAH fingerprints of different PAH sources, and then we give it the fingerprint for one of our sediments, and we say, okay, statistically, what is the best way to combine these different sources to recreate the fingerprint that we see in our sediments? So we did that for lake sediments from different urban lakes across the United States, and we found out what proportion of the total PAHs were coming from different Sealcoat sources in the urban environment. So here we're looking at urban lakes in the western, central, and eastern United States. And the orange is the contribution from Sealcoat, and the blue from vehicle, black from coal, and from these other urban sources. And we're looking here at the total PAH concentration in the surface sediments in these lakes. And we see that Sealcoat is making up more than actually on average, about 50% of the PAHs in these urban lakes, with vehicles and coal burning emissions coming in second and third for the most important contributors. We also see, here again is this probable effect concentration. This is the concentration at which we would expect to see adverse ecological effects, and we're exceeding it in many of these lakes in the central and eastern U.S., and a lot of the contribution to exceeding this PEC, probable effect concentration, is coming from coal tar-based Sealcoat. Now let's go back to our trends question. What is the source of these upward trends? So here we're looking at 6 new urban lakes across the United States. And these are, when I say new urban, these are lakes where the watersheds have urbanized over the last, say, 20 to 30 years. And we used our statistical source apportionment method to determine which sources were most important in contributing to the PAH concentrations in these lakes. And what we see is that coal tar-based Sealcoat is the cause of these upward trends in 5 of the 6 lakes that are shown here. The only one where it's not the most important source is Railroad Canyon Lake in Southern California, where vehicle-related sources are the most important. Coal tar-based seal coat is very rarely used in California. And I want to point out, take a look at the scale of the PAH concentrations in this lake. They're about 100 times less than some of the concentrations in some of those lakes in other parts of the country where coal tar-based seal coat is commonly used. So this is telling us that these upward trends that we're seeing across the United States might very likely be related to the use of coal tar-based seal coat. So why is this important? Why do we care? Well, it's been shown by many different scientists in many different parts of the U.S. and actually across the world that PAHs have very severe consequences for a wide range of species, from insects and amphibians to fish to birds to mammals. Since we first published our information on coal tar-based seal coat, some scientists have looked specifically at environmental effects related to this product and and shown adverse environmental effects both for two different types of amphibians and also for ecological communities. One real risk that is associated with use of the seal coat is runoff that occurs shortly after the product has been applied. And there have been some documented occurrences of fish kills associated with runoff events, with rainstorms that happened within hours after seal coat was applied. We've recently been investigating this because as a result, the seal coat industry has recommended that seal coat not be applied if there is a risk of rainfall within 24 hours. So we did some toxicity experiments, and this is we're in the process of publishing this. But the short story is we did see toxic effects on fathead minnows, which is a typical laboratory test organism, and also Daphnia, Cereodaphnia, which is an invertebrate. We saw toxic effects if runoff occurred within 24 to 48 hours after application. We also, however, continued to see toxic effects for as much as 3 months after application in the presence of UV light, in other words, in the presence of sunlight. So this issue of wash-off and toxicity does appear to be a real concern. Now, PAHs, of course, are a concern not just for exposure to ecological communities, but also to humans. There are a lot of different ways that we can come into contact with coal tar-based seal coat as it's used on our parking lots and our driveways. One of the most important concerns associated with dust is ingestion of house dust. And we were curious to see if use of coal tar-based seal coat on an exterior surface, like a parking lot or a driveway, translated into higher concentrations in house dust. So we, again, another reason I love my job, instead of sweeping parking lots, we got out the vacuum. And we vacuumed driveways, parking lots, and interior areas in 23 different apartments in Austin. And we chose apartments were on the ground floor, and we chose 12 that had a parking lot surface that did not have coal tar-based seal coat. It either had the asphalt-based seal coat, it had an asphalt surface with no seal coat at all, or it had a concrete surface. And then we vacuumed apartments, 11 of which had coal tar-based seal coat. If we look at what we found on the parking lots, it lines up very well with what we saw in our previous sweeping study, where we saw very low concentrations, around 10 or less, on the parking lot itself, and similar concentrations in the house dust. And there was no statistically significant difference between what we measured outdoors and what we measured indoors. Similar to what we saw in our sweeping study, concentrations of PAHs, this is the median concentration on the coal tar seal coated parking lots, was about 500 times higher than what we measured on those parking lots that did not have coal tar based seal coat. and it did translate into a statistically significant higher concentration in the house dust. So inside these apartments, on average, the PAH concentrations in the house dust was about 25 times higher than what we measured in the indoor house dust for those apartments that did not have the coal tar-based seal coat. This raises an interesting question regarding ingestion because small children tend to eat dust. They put their hands and they put toys and other objects into their mouths. And ingestion of dust has been shown to be an important pathway for exposure to a number of different chemicals, including lead and pesticides. Now, traditionally, the paradigm or the common understanding has been that our exposure to PAHs, the largest exposure that we have to PAHs, is through dietary ingestion. In other words, through ingestion of grilled meats, even ingestion of vegetables has been assumed to be the greatest exposure pathway for humans to PAHs. But that didn't take into account the fact that in some of these residences, the house dust has very high concentrations of PAHs. So we worked with Dr. Spencer Williams at Baylor University, who's a human health risk analyst, and with him as the lead scientist, we investigated some of these health implications of PAHs associated with coal tar-based seal coat. And the first thing we looked at is what contribution does ingestion of house dust make to our PAH exposure, or specifically to the PAH exposure for preschoolers if they live in a residence with a coal tar sealed driveway or parking lot. So here what we're looking at on the x-axis is the PAH dose of those 7 carcinogens, 7 PAHs that are known probable human carcinogens. So those carcinogenic PAHs are referred to by the health community as B2 PAHs. So here we're looking at the dose of B2 PAHs. Here is published average dietary ingestion of PAHs for a preschooler. It's about 25 nanograms of carcinogenic PAH per kilogram of child per day. Those are our dose units. For the child that ingests a relatively low amount of house dust, and these are published dust ingestion rates published by the EPA, they ingest through non-dietary ingestion, in other words, through ingestion of house dust, if they have a coal tar seal-coated parking lot, they are more than doubling their PAH dose. About double their dietary ingestion is coming from ingestion of house dust, and a relatively small amount is coming for those children that live in a residence that does not have a coal tar seal-coated parking lot. So that's for the child that ingests a relatively small amount of dust. We also looked at the child that ingests a higher concentration of dust, about 100 milligrams per day. And in that case, that child is ingesting almost 10 times higher PAH dose from ingestion of house dust than they're getting through dietary ingestion. So this sets this paradigm on its head that, in fact, for children that live in residences with coal tar-based seal coat, ingestion of house dust turns out to be the most important, or a much more important PAH exposure pathway than dietary ingestion. Now, how much dust is this? 100 milligrams per day. Well, a baby aspirin weighs 80 milligrams. So we're really, even for a high house dust ingestion scenario, we're really talking about a relatively small amount of dust. So is this PAH exposure through dust and, I'm going to add soil also, ingestion, is that an important, do we need to care about this? Could this be contributing to cancer risk? So again, we worked with Dr. Spencer Williams at Baylor University, and we looked here at ingestion of both house dust and contaminated soils adjacent to seal-coated surfaces. And we compared the excess lifetime cancer risk associated with urban background, in other words, living adjacent to a parking lot or driveway that does not have coal tar seal coat, to that of the excess lifetime cancer risk associated to living all of your life next to a seal-coated parking lot or driveway. So here is the excess lifetime cancer risk associated with urban background. And here is that associated with living adjacent to a coal tar seal-coated surface. And we see that about a fifth of that excess cancer risk is associated with ingestion of house dust, and the other 4/5 is associated with ingestion of contaminated soil. But even for the house dust, this represents a rather large increase in excess cancer risk. If we take the house dust and the soil together, it's a 38 times, not 38%. This is a 38 times increase in cancer risk. And the cancer risk exceeds 1 in 10,000, which the EPA generally considers as a threshold above which remediation is recommended. Now, I want to stress here, this is not an epidemiological study. This is a risk analysis, so it's based on concentrations in soil and what we know about habits of ingestion and potential cancer risk associated with different chemicals. But this is what this is indicating is that it may be of value to do some more serious epidemiological-based studies investigating this particular product and cancer risk. So contaminated house dust and soil is not the only way that we can be exposed to PAHs associated with coal tar-based seal coat. PAHs, some of the ones that are lower molecular weight, in other words, those that are 2 or 3 rings, are fairly volatile, meaning that they evaporate into the environment. And in fact, if you've walked across a parking lot while it's been seal-coated or in the days or weeks afterwards, you've probably noticed a strong odor. And if you can smell it, that means that those chemicals are volatilizing. So we were interested in investigating how much of the PAHs, when they're spread out on that parking lot in the seal coat, how much of those are volatilizing into the air. And the reason this is of concern, well, it's of concern for a lot of reasons, but there have been studies that have indicated that PAHs in air are exacerbate asthma and other respiratory diseases. There have been studies that have shown that exposure to PAHs in the air by pregnant mothers reduces the child's IQ. And there have been other demonstrated human health effects associated with exposure to PAHs in the air. So we measured PAHs volatilizing off unsealed asphalt parking lots. In fact, this is the parking lot here at the USGS. I'm looking out at my window right now. And we also measured PAHs volatilizing off parking lots that had been sealed months to years previously. So that was our first attempt. And if we measure PAHs coming off an unsealed asphalt parking lot, and remember, asphalt does contain low concentrations of PAHs. For a square meter of parking lot, over the course of 1 hour, about 1.4 micrograms of PAHs is volatilizing off into the air. If we compare that then to what's coming off parking lots that were sealed months to years before, they are still volatilizing about 88 micrograms in 1 hour off a square meter of parking lot. So about 60 times more PAHs are volatilizing every hour of coal tar sealed surfaces, even those that were sealed years previously, versus what is coming off unsealed asphalt. So I want you to remember this 88 number, because then we thought, well, it would be interesting to measure what is volatilizing off parking lots just after they've been sealed, because that's when the smell is the strongest. So what are the concentrations, or how much PAHs, what mass of PAHs is being emitted just after sealant application? So we used a test plot here in Austin. The University of Texas very kindly allowed us to use a parking lot as a test plot, and we had it commercially sealed with a coal tar-based sealant. And as soon as we could get out on the parking lot, we went out there and we set up our sampling apparatus, and we collected samples 6 hours after application, 12 hours application, 24 hours after application, and on out for a couple of months after application to see how those concentrations changed over time. So remembering this 88 number, let's take a look at what we found. Here's the flux, or the mass that is being emitted off the parking lot, and as you can see, it's a whole lot more than 88. So 88 is way down here at this steady state concentration days after application, but during the first few weeks following application, more than 40,000 micrograms of PAH are being emitted every hour from a square meter of pavement. So let's take a look at that more closely. Looking at these first 2 weeks, we also we can draw a line through these and come up with an exponential decrease in concentrations over time, eventually coming down to that 88 number. We also measured day and night concentrations because, of course, there's more volatilization when it's hot. And so there's less at night and more during the day, and so we have this diurnal fluctuation. And we can integrate the area under this curve to get a total mass of PAHs that volatilizes off a square meter of parking lot for the first 2 weeks after sealant. And that number happens to be 2.5 grams. So we can, 2.5 grams of PAHs volatilizing over the course of 2 weeks after application from a square meter of parking lot. We can use this to put it into context, to compare it to other PAH sources and say, well, is this important or is this negligible? So let's get out our calculators here. From the industry, we learned that about 85 million gallons of coal tar-based seal coat are applied every year. And that's enough to cover about 440 square kilometers. Now from our experiment, we found that each square meter over just the first 2 weeks following application is emitting about 2.5 grams of PAHs. Now caution here, this may be an underestimate because we discovered when we did additional experiments in the following years that the product that had been applied was actually a relatively low PAH product, and that many of the products out there have concentrations that are 2 or more times higher. So this 2.5 number is actually erring on the side of being conservative. That gives us nationwide a grand total of about 1,000 megagrams, or in other words, 1,000 metric tons of PAHs are being emitted. And this is just in the first 2 weeks after application every year in the U.S. from coal tar seal coat applications. Compare that to automobile emissions, which are actually less than a metric ton. So more PAHs, by this estimate, are being emitted from coal tar sealed parking lots every year than from vehicles. You know, total PAH emissions to air are on the order of 10 megatons. So in fact, this single product is responsible for 10% or more of total PAH emissions to the air. So we've covered dust, we've covered sediment, we've covered house dust, pavement dust, house dust, sediment, air. I want to circle back to our trends question, our upward trends in PAHs. And that question that comes about, does what go down the storm drain, is it really affecting the PAH trends that we're measuring in the sediment? And although we did our statistical modeling and it indicated that the seal coat was an important contributor, really the proof is in the pudding. And we have a chance to test that on the ground here in Austin, Texas, in a publication that just came out this year. Austin, Texas banned the use of coal tar-based seal coat in 2006. We had collected a sediment core from Lady Bird Lake, which runs through the center of Austin, prior to the ban in the late 1900s. That's right, it was 1999, I believe, that the sediment core was collected. And then we collected another sediment core, actually several sediment cores, the last couple of years. And we can take a look at these trends and see what's happened. We also have some bed sediment samples that were collected at these red dot sites before the ban and after the ban, in addition to our sediment core. So here we're looking at the estimated date of sediment deposition as recorded in our sediment cores versus the concentration of PAHs. So the City of Austin banned coal tar seal coat use in 2006. Here's the sediment core that we collected in the late 1990s, and you see this very strong upward trend. And in fact, this is one of the lakes that I showed you earlier where we did the source apportionment and determined that much of these PAHs were coming from coal tar-based seal coat. Here's another long sediment core that we collected in just the last few years. So it starts at the same period, the 1960s. This is when the lake was built, with the dam was put in. And we're starting to see this decrease in the 2000s. We collected another sediment core that was shallower and gave us more detailed information on the more recent sediments. And we see an even more detailed picture of what's going on in these more recent sediments. We have some additional surface sediments down here, and then we have two sites where we have samples that were collected before the ban and after the ban. So if we take a look at sediment samples that were collected before the ban, just before the ban, and we compare them to those collected in the last few years, the average concentration, we're seeing a 58% decrease in PAH concentrations since the ban was put in place. Some additional good news is that we have reason to believe that these concentrations will continue to decrease, because seal coat that was applied 10 years ago is still in the process of eroding and is still contributing to the PAHs that we're measuring now in Lady Bird Lake. We can use that source apportionment method to investigate how PAH sources have changed from the late 1990s to 2012, 2014. So in the late 1990s, we were seeing a large contribution of PAHs from the coal tar seal coat. We've now seen that that concentration and that contribution have decreased, but still by far the largest contributor to PAHs in Lady Bird Lake is coal tar-based seal coat. So as that continues to be eroded and wash out off of parking lots, wash out of creeks, and the stocks are depleted, we expect that we will continue to see this decreasing trend. So I think I've used up almost my hour allotment here, and we've got some time for questions. We do have a website that provides links to all of the publications that I've discussed here. We also have a nice 6-page color fact sheet that explains this in a very understandable way for the lay audience. You are welcome to contact me or my colleague, Pete Van Meter, either by email or by phone if you have any additional questions or would like any additional materials. I think that Melanie is going to be posting this presentation, and as additional slides, I won't go through them all now, but as additional slides, I've included a bibliography of all the different sources that I cited in this publication. So if you want to go directly to the source and obtain those materials, you are welcome to. And at this point, I think that we have plenty of time for questions, if there are any that I can answer for you.
All right, at this time, folks are welcome to send questions in to us. All right, I see one question to sort of kick us off, and thank you also for the comment received. Where are the PAHs in the lake going once the source is eliminated? So again, where are the PAHs in the lake going once the source is eliminated? And we make sure that we have you unmuted, Barbara.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Where are they going? They're getting buried. So what we see in our sediment cores is we see higher concentrations at greater depths for things like PAHs in town, like DDT, PCBs. So as a chemical is banned and if the inputs decrease, we get cleaner sediment coming in and burying those contaminants. Now, some contaminants at depth in the lake will degrade, and others do not. PAHs tend to be pretty persistent. We likely see some degradation of the lower molecular weight PAHs, those that are 2 or 3 rings, but the higher molecular weight PAHs are quite persistent in the environment. So what we're seeing is lower concentrations in the shallower sediments as less and less PAHs are coming in, but we will continue to see those high concentrations in the deeper sediments.
Great, thank you, Barbara. We have another question that's just come in. Have any studies been performed on workers that apply coal tar sealants? Good question.
Excellent question, because they are clearly the front line. Not to date. There have been studies done on roofing workers because roofers, some of the tar that's applied on roofs is a coal tar-based tar, and there has been an association seen between cancer rates and that particular career. However, I do know of one proposal that is out to do an epidemiological study on coal tar seal coat applicators.
Very interesting. What has been the industry's response to this research, Barbara, and is the coal tar industry a separate industry from the asphalt-based seal coat industry?
Yes, and sort of. What has been the industry's reaction? There has been a large amount of pushback. There is a group called the Pavement Coatings Technology Council, the PCTC, which represents the coal tar seal coat industry. And they have been extremely active in lobbying, in attending meetings where bans are being considered. They attend, they present, they have hired consultants who have attempted to refute our science. They have a website. They respond with comments to newspaper articles, and they've been very present. They have served us with several Freedom of Information Acts to supply them with all of our emails, our data, our lab notes. They have, in fact, some of this is some of the information when they've hit us. Well, that's not quite the right adjective. We have been served with Data Quality Act challenge, and we are required legally to respond to that. And the ones that are available are posted on our website. So they have been very active. Are the coal tar seal coat and the asphalt seal coat industry the same or different? They are represented in general by different lobbying groups. The PCTC is focusing its efforts on the coal tar seal coat industry. However, there are a number of producers that or companies that make both types of product.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. So let's see. Are coal tar sealants, do coal tar sealants outperform asphalt sealants?
That is a question that you would probably be best put to applicators. Has not been an area that we have investigated. I think if you ask applicators on the West Coast or applicators who use the asphalt product, they will tell you one thing, and if you talk to those that use the coal tar-based product, they will tell you another. One question I'd like to raise is, what does work better mean? Also, are we talking about how fast does it wear off, or does it actually protect the underlying asphalt?
Gotcha. These are really good questions coming in. There's a question about volume, Barbara, so if the population, let's assume these numbers are correct here, is about 12 million, then there would be somewhere between 3 to 10 million gallons used in Ohio, and is that a fair estimate of volume or weight, I suppose?
Boy, I'd have to, that's one where somebody should maybe contact me offline and we can work through the numbers. I know that an applicator in Springfield, Missouri, which is a smaller area, and I can work. I'm more familiar with the numbers, but he estimated that about 200 gallons of coal tar seal coat were applied per person each year in that city.
Okay. All right.
So you could maybe scale that to Ohio, but up to Ohio. But I would. Why don't you contact whoever asked that question? Please feel free to contact me, and we can discuss it.
And I'll provide Barbara's. I can provide Barbara's contact information in the follow-up email, which contains our survey as a follow-up to today's webinar. Let's move on to the next question. So one participant is wondering why the continental divide in the use of asphalt-based versus coal tar-based sealant. If you can, I think you touched on that, but expand on that a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. You know, it's something that we heard about first anecdotally through applicators, and then our research seemed to follow it up, and I did an informal survey of home improvement stores also to find out who was carrying what types of product, and it seemed to really hold up, and I think it has nothing to do with you know, California being an environmentally aware state and the East Coast not being environmentally aware. It's really an economic artifact of the source of the product. So coal tar is the residue that remains after the coking of coal for the steel industry. And historically, those coking plants, and therefore the coal tar distillery plants, were located in the eastern United States and primarily around the Great Lakes. And that's still where the greatest concentration of coal tar-based seal coat use occurs. The asphalt-based seal coat is based on the residue from the petroleum distillation process, petroleum refining, and there are a lot of petroleum refineries on the West Coast. I think a lot of the expense associated with this product is purely transportation, because we're talking about something that largely is a residue. It's what's left over after the coking of coal. The coal tar, crude coal tar, then goes through a distillation process, and the lighter weight oils, which have economic value, commercial value, are drawn off, and what's left is coal tar pitch, and that's what goes in the coal tar seal coat. So a lot of the expense then is associated with transportation, and it makes more sense to use what you don't have to drive very far. You don't have to ship very far. A little bit of a footnote to that is that, interestingly, over the last decade or so, as the steel industry in the U.S. has declined and we're producing less coal tar in this country, we now are some years importing coal tar from Mexico for use in these products. And the cost of the product, both the asphalt and the coal tar based, fluctuates based on how much petroleum, or what the price of petroleum is, how much petroleum refining is going on, how much coal tar is being produced in the U.S. So the prices of those two products will fluctuate from year to year on the basis of the abundance of raw materials.
Well, very interesting. And sort of a follow-up question then, Barbara, how available is the asphalt-based seal coat here in Ohio and in the eastern United States then for folks that might, want to think about using using that as an alternative, assuming we have some kind of citizens, and I guess we all have, most of us have driveways, so how available is that product?
Well, I can't, I can tell you in general what I know, and it would probably be possible to contact applicators and ask them to, they probably have a better line on this than I do. I do know that major home improvement stores, so Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace, and some other home improvement stores no longer carry the coal tar-based product. So across the country, the asphalt-based product is available in the 5-gallon bucket to the consumer at home improvement stores. I also know that in those areas or those cities or states where the coal tar-based product has been banned, that applicators are using the asphalt-based product. It's not that Sealcoat application has ceased entirely. They have switched products. It may be that if there is not demand, particularly in the East Coast and where everybody is used to using one type of product, that until there is the demand for the other type of product, it's not cost effective to supply it. But from what I understand, as one type of product has been phased out, there doesn't seem to be an issue with replacing it with use of the alternative product. Another thing I want to add is that I focused here because when we first started doing this work on the asphalt and the coal tar-based products, I have learned recently that there is a latex-based product that has been put on the market where the black coloring comes from ground-up automobile tires, which have they contain PAHs, but at a similar concentration to what's in asphalt, so about 50 parts per million, a relatively low concentration, relatively speaking. And so there is this third product type on the market but we have not done any investigations of either PAHs associated with that, and it's the kind of thing that if you were interested in performance, you might be able to find some information on the web.
Great. We still have questions coming in. This is really wonderful, really engaged audience here. So, Barbara, if coal tar sealant usage was somehow banned, and I know you talked about a ban in one of the slides, and the resulting levels of PAHs in, I think, Ladybird Lake. But the question is, would there be a coal tar disposal issue or challenge?
In other words, would we have so much coal tar that we weren't using in Sealcoat, what would we do with it? Well, given the fact that some years we're importing coal tar, that suggests that probably would not be an issue. Most of the coal tar pitch that is produced in the United States goes to the aluminum industry. I think about 85% of it is used in the aluminum industry. So that would indicate that changing how much is used in coal tar Sealcoat probably would not create a glut on the market. But that's one of those economics research questions that would be interesting for someone in that field to investigate.
Great. Well, really good questions. It looks like we've come to the end of our questions, although, last opportunity, if there's anyone else that hasn't had a chance to ask a question, has a burning question, please submit that now. I will give a few notes here to kind of wrap us up. Want to ask again if folks could please take that 5 minutes or less to fill out a survey, which will be delivered today via email to all participants. This survey actually helps us just to get a bit of evaluation data, which helps us with our funding to be able to offer educational webinars and workshops like we've done here today. Want to take a moment to thank our guest speaker, Dr. Barbara Mahler. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your research and your expertise in this area. I also want to thank Freshwater Future for support for this webinar. Freshwater Future is an organization based in Michigan, which works to ensure the healthy future of our waters in the Great Lakes region, and they have been doing work on this issue in a few states, including Michigan. And finally, if participants still with us right now would like to view the webinar slides and recording, we do have slides that we keep in SlideShare and I believe a recording in YouTube, which we will make available on our OEC webpage. You would go under Resources and then under Webinars, and you would click to find our archived webinars, and you'll be able to find that within the week, where we will have this recorded in case you'd like to share with your colleagues or go back and review some of that information. Seeing no other questions, this concludes our webinar today on coal tar-based sealants. Thank you again, Barbara.
Thanks for having me, Melanie. And I would encourage any of you that have questions to please don't hesitate to contact me, and if I don't know the answer, which is entirely possible, I know a lot of people that I might be able to refer you to.
Wonderful. Barbara, did you, well, I'll make sure to share your email address with folks who attended today's webinar.
That'd be great.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today. Have a great rest of your day, and that concludes our webinar. Thank you.